It's the eve of Israel's deliverance from bondage in Egypt. 9 plagues have devastated the land of Egypt, but the 10th is going to utterly demoralize the Egyptian people. It's clear that by the time that the 8th and the 9th plagues occur, all but a handful of Pharaoh's closest advisors are opposed to his policy of refusing to let the Hebrews go. The Egyptians, we're told, have come to honor the Hebrews and to esteem their leader, Moses. Pharaoh has lost status with his own people, and he tries to recoup that status, you will remember, by offering a compromise with Moses on the terms of who and what can worship God out in the wilderness. But Moses steadfastly refuses any of these compromises, any of these negotiations. When they leave, they are all to leave and all that they have. In fact, they're going to go out with even more because the Egyptian people are going to load them up with treasure as a kind of back wages for all the years that they have served as slaves. But Pharaoh has been intractable. So one final plague is going to strike Egypt that will move Pharaoh and his cronies to not just let Israel go, they are going to drive them out. And that plague, that 10th plague, is the death of the firstborn in every home that does not have the blood of a lamb splattered on its door frame. In our study last week, we saw that all of this was prophetic and pointed to Jesus, who is our Passover lamb, whose death atones for our sins and delivers us from bondage to sin and death. Let's pick it up at verse 21 of chapter 12. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop," which is a branch of a bush. "You'll dip it in blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel," that's the beam above the doorway, "and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over." And that's where we get the title Passover from. The Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. Now, we went over this as God gave the instructions to them for the details of the keeping of the Passover and the selecting of the lamb, and it was to spend 4 days with them in their home, and then they were to kill it in the evening and so on, and now they were to eat the meal with their shoes on their feet and their staff in their hand, and their traveling clothes on. We took a look at all of God's instructions in that last week. If you weren't here, you can get the CD or listen online to the study. My question tonight is, there are so many rituals that God could have given to provide protection from the destroying angel. Think about how many he could have used, all kinds of different rituals that the people could have performed to protect them. Why this one? Why take blood from the Passover lamb and strike the beam above the doorway and both doorposts? Why sacrifice a lamb that they had allowed to live in their home with them for 4 days and then place its blood on their doorframe? The answer to why is because God is giving them a picture of what Jesus would do. And that's why he then tells them that they are to reenact the Passover every year, so that it would be an abiding lesson that would be driven home and they would not forget it, and it would prime their hearts to receive Christ when he came and fulfilled all these things that this looks prophetically towards. Look at verse 24. "And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons," what? "Forever. It will come to pass that when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' that you will say, 'It's the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households.' So the people bowed their heads in worship. Then the children of Israel went away and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did. Passover was to be an annual celebration in which the parents rehearsed for their children the redemptive acts of God. So you just picture the family scene there. Here they are at the table. They're going through all this. There's very much a ritual and a liturgy that's involved at each step of the Passover meal. And at some point, those children are going to get to the point, they're going to get old enough when they're going to say to mom and dad, why do we do this? And it's then that you're to rehearse for them, you're to tell them what God has done for you. You know, some of our annual holidays are based on the events of the gospel. Parents and grandparents should take these holidays as an opportunity to share with our children and our grandchildren what God has done for us. It's regrettable that the two big holidays on our calendar are Christmas and Halloween. No, not Halloween. Christmas and Easter, both of which commemorate important parts of the gospel, the birth and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But sadly, they have been gutted of their meaning, become very secular holidays, and many Americans, believe it or not, don't even know that these things commemorate moments in the life of Christ. And so it's important that we as Christians pass this on to our children and use the holidays as a way to let them know about what God has done in history. I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. Verse 29, and it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. As I mentioned last week, when God first told Moses about this final plague back in chapter 11, the reason that the firstborn were struck was because in the ancient Middle East, the firstborn represented their future. Just think about a young couple. Even today, young couples want children, sometimes can have a difficult time having children. And because of medical technology, you know, there's kind of ways around that. Just think about the ancient world. They didn't have those technologies. And when you have an agriculturally based economy, your future, your prosperity was based on how many children you had. The more children you had, the more help you had, the more prosperous your household could be, the larger your estate would grow. And people in that time always lived with a thought towards the future. They didn't live for themselves. Everything they did was for future generations. That's why they were so careful about protecting their reputation and their name, and wanted to make sure that shame was never attached to the family name, because this was something that you would pass on to your children. And so people longed for kids. They married early. Ladies in the ancient world would start having kids at 13, 14 years old. Because remember, they're only living to be 30, 35 years old. And so the childbearing years were short. And so people wanted children. And so you have this young couple. Now think about it. Here they are. They want to pop out a kid as quick as possible. But they have a hard time. They begin to struggle. Now think about in that culture, when children are your future, if you're barren, if you're having a hard time having children, what are the prospects for your future? You know, all my ancestors have led up to me. Am I going to be the end of our family? You can just imagine what a burden that would be on people. So when they had that first child, it was relief, because it spoke of the future. It meant hope. It was their strength. Typically, you had your firstborn, obviously, your youngest, right? It's your strength. It's the future. It's your hope. All the hopes and dreams of the family were wrapped up in the firstborn. If the firstborn died, a family was robbed of hope. Their future was in peril. Pharaoh's foolish resistance to God had resulted in catastrophe for his people. Although note that anyone in Egypt who partook of Passover and applied the blood to their doorframe was protected. This wasn't just for the Jews. We're going to read later that when Israel left Egypt, a large number of others, that the Bible calls a mixed multitude, went with them. In Egypt that night, people had a choice to follow Pharaoh's example of ignoring God or Israel's example of obeying him. What they chose decided whether the next morning would see mourning or rejoicing in their home. Some of us attended a breakfast yesterday where a well-known pastor and Bible teacher spoke. He's regarded as one of the finest expositors of the Bible around today. But he made a statement with which I disagree. While elevating the role and the work of pastors as they teach God's word, this Bible teacher denigrated the role of presidents, saying that ultimately they don't matter. I disagree. God consistently judges kingdoms and nations on the behavior of their rulers and their leaders. When they oppose God, when they defy his word, they are judged and their people are judged. But when they follow godly precepts, God's blessing flows. Pharaoh's decision to ignore God cost his people greatly, did it not? When our elected officials ignore God, it's the average citizens who will pay. Keep that in mind as you go to the polls in a couple of weeks. The anguished cry of a mother and a father at the loss of their child is a horrible sound. I've heard it. I've been in the homes and the hospital rooms where parents have lost their infant children or even grown children. It's a terrible sound to hear the lament of a mother or a father. Well, friends, multiply that by thousands and you get an idea of how terrible this judgment was in Egypt. Not a house that lacked a bloody door was left without a death that night. Verse 31, then he, that is Pharaoh, called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve Yahweh, as you've said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you've said, and be gone, and bless me also. Note that. You know, Pharaoh is like many rulers in that his word means little. Earlier he said that Moses would never see his face again, yet here he's calling for him so that he can tell him, hey, listen, go out, go ahead. This time, notice that there's no negotiating. There's no appeals to compromise. And Pharaoh seems to relent a bit there at the end when he, throws on that P.S. Oh, and bless me. Now, should we take that to mean that Pharaoh is repentant? Is this evidence of faith on his part? Not at all. Because it's not going to be long before Pharaoh will be leading the army out in an attempt to return Israel to bondage. Verse 33, and the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. See, the Egyptians had no way of knowing if there would be more plagues. What's next? Is the youngest slated for death as well? And so they urged the Hebrews to get moving before 11th or a 12th plague can set in. Verse 34, so the people, that is the Hebrews, took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their cloths on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. So the count here is men aged 13 and up. We know that because we know from the culture of that time, for Hebrew culture, a boy becomes a man at 13, bar mitzvah. It's the men that are counted. So these are men 13 and up. The earlier Egyptian policy of throwing baby boys into the Nile meant that the ratio of men to women was far less than normal. There were far more women than men. Also, and this is interesting, history has shown that during times of intense extremity, such as the harsh conditions that Israel endured in Egypt as slaves, women survive longer than men. This is just a little interesting fact of history. Hey, listen, when it's tough, the women tend to outlast the guys. They're tougher. Anybody that has to pop out kids knows they're tougher. So they go from being slaves of Yahweh. Oh, excuse me. So, jumped ahead there. So 600,000 men, 13 and older. You could easily double the number of women and then add in the kids, as it says. The kids weren't included. We may have a population of between 2 and 3 million people that are leaving Egypt. But notice this, verse 38. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. This mixed multitude weren't descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, they weren't Hebrews. This was a mixture of Egyptians and other ethnic groups who had intermarried with Israel during their time there in Egypt. It's likely that it also included other enslaved folk who saw the door opening for freedom here, and man, they rushed through it, And if anybody's saying, well, what are you doing? Say, I'm a Hebrew. It's just, they're not, but they see this as an opportunity for freedom, and so out they go. Now, and remember that the Hebrews have been given favor with many of the Egyptians, so you can just picture that some of the poor of Egyptian society who've not been able to make it in Egypt, they see this as an opportunity as well. And so this mixed multitude goes out. They are going to be a source of huge trouble for Israel later. Verse 39. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. That is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. I love this. So note the change in identity as they leave Egypt. Did you notice that? They go from being slaves to the army of Yahweh. In fact, I love that so much, that's what we're going to talk about on Sunday. Now, there's a parenthesis now as God gives additional instructions about how they were to commemorate Passover. Verse 43, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. So, in other words, here are instructions for keeping Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. So, in other words, this was to be a memorial only for the Jews to observe because it was part of their unique covenant with God. And there's a bit of a parallel here because our celebration of communion has as its backdrop what? Jewish Passover. And just as it was only Jews, people in covenant with God, that were to celebrate the Passover, so it ought to be only believers and followers of Jesus Christ that partake of communion. This is not something for unbelievers to participate in. This is something for the people who are in covenant with God. Verse 46, in one house, God says, it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside of the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. So God is saying, listen, you're not to be innovative in how you celebrate the Passover. It's not a banquet. This isn't a movable feast. You're not to keep any leftovers from this. And it was to be kept the same way every year so that each generation could renew its identity in and link back to the first generation that had seen God's mighty deeds. And in the Jewish mind, anybody here Jewish? Do we have any people that were Jewish, grew up in a Jewish household? Okay, back, Mike. The mentality when you sit at the Passover meal, the whole mentality is to go back and be like one of the original Jews that celebrated the first Passover. It was our people, we were there, who we are today came out of those people. We are their descendants. And so when they partook of that first Passover, we were there in them. And this year, as we celebrate it, we are seeking to understand ourselves as part of that generation. We went out, not they went out. We went out of bondage in Egypt. So they were not to innovate. They were not to come up with new things. This prohibition on the breaking of bones of the Passover lamb is another clue that this is all meant to point the people to Jesus. Because a Sabbath was about to start in the afternoon of Jesus' crucifixion, the Jewish leaders went to the Roman governor Pilate and appealed to him to hasten the death of Jesus and the thieves that were crucified on each side of him. You see, it was against the law to allow any dead body to be out defiling the land on a holy day. And so they asked that the legs of the crucified be broken so that they could no longer push themselves up and take a breath. And thus they would suffocate. It would hasten their death. But when the soldiers came to Jesus' cross, they realized that he was already dead. They could tell by his pallor, by the fact that his chest wasn't rising and falling, that he wasn't pushing himself. He was gone. He was expired. And to prove it, they ran a spear into his chest, fulfilling two prophecies. One, that none of Jesus' bones would be broken, and that his side would be pierced. But we might ask why God wanted to ensure that none of Jesus' bones would be broken. Well, one is simply because this is one more thing that points to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. But second, blood is made in the marrow at the center of the bone. When a bone is broken, it stops making blood. And so it was important that none of Jesus' bones be broken so that we might realize there is a never-ending supply of the blood of Jesus Christ to cleanse us from sin. Verse 47, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it, and when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So God makes it clear here at the start of what comes to be the nation of Israel and the genesis of the law. He's saying, listen, Gentiles can convert to Judaism. Those not born into the covenant can be adopted into it. Verse 50, thus all the children of Israel did, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their what? According to their armies. Just again, we'll come back to this on Sunday, but I just love this. Because what are they at this point? How do they see themselves? Is this an army? What is it? It's a workforce of? It's a bunch of slaves. They're seeing themselves as slaves, but notice God calls them an army. An army. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that on Sunday. I want to preach right now, but I have to hold it in. And we'll look at it on Sunday. In addition to Passover, God gives them additional ways by which to remember the Exodus in verse 1 of chapter 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine. When you consecrate something, you set it apart for a special purpose. The Hebrew word is kadash, and it means to dedicate something to a specific and special purpose. It's turning something over to the exclusive use and service of God. While the firstborn died in the 10th plague, God says that all those that have been saved by the blood of the Passover lamb now belong to him. How they're to be consecrated to him is going to be spelled out later. Verse 3, and Moses said to the people, remember this day. Let's all say that together. Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand Yahweh brought you out of this place. No unleavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month of Abib. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to give to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in its month. So God gave the guidelines for keeping the week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread back in chapter 12. We looked at that last week. Here he tells them that they are to use it to remember the Exodus by, when their departure was so hasty that their bread couldn't rise. Now let's pause here and note how important the observance of these holidays were for Israel. God calls them to keep them as memorials to his redemptive acts. As you're well aware, our holidays have been divorced from that which makes them holy days. Christmas has been gutted of its connection to Christ's birth, while Easter has been turned from the celebration of his resurrection into the eating of chocolate eggs. And there are even religious groups, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who eschew even the gospel meaning of the holidays. They don't celebrate the holidays. They ignore them. In fact, they think it's a sin to celebrate them. Now, please understand, some of our holidays have biblical roots. And the whole idea of using them as annual times to pass on to later generations what God has done in history. Listen, friends, this is rooted in Scripture. God himself says, I want you to celebrate these things every year. And you're to use them to commemorate what I have done. Our faith isn't just some philosophy. Our faith isn't the result of some sage guru who sat on a mountaintop in the lotus position and enlightened himself, by smoking peyote buttons and then came off with some crazy things. We don't believe stuff just because someone spoke something that wowed people. Our faith is rooted in real-life historical events. The Exodus of Israel from bondage in Egypt, and our exodus from bondage to sin through the cross of Jesus Christ. We need to understand that the Bible is centered around these two great events. The Old Testament looks to the Exodus as the birth of Israel, their birth as a nation. They're entering into covenant with God there at Mount Sinai. And the New Testament looks at the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All of history hangs on these two major events. Our faith is not just, some theology that somebody stuck in a book somewhere. It's the result of stuff that happened in history. And this is why it's so important for us to be well educated as Christians, convinced of what we believe. Because we live in a world that says Christianity is just, one of many religions. No, it's not. The gospel is the truth. It's based in fact. It's based in history. Many Christians are worried about the pagan associations that have been attached to the holidays. Every year at Christmas and Easter, we are asked, should we celebrate Christmas? Should we celebrate Easter? And the question is, well, celebrate how? So many of our traditions and our rituals have no connection whatsoever to the gospel. What does a Christmas tree have to do with the birth of Jesus? Well, and then people will say, well, it has pagan origins. Well, okay, but the thing is, no one today has a Christmas tree and thinks, let's worship some idol, right? The problem with our rituals today is they have no meaning. They're empty of meaning. Mom, why do we put a Christmas tree in the living room? I have no idea. It smells nice. It's something to hang lights on. Well, why do we hang lights on it? Because they're pretty. We have to have something to put the presents under. Why do we give presents? Are you saying you don't want any presents? We don't have any answers to our kids. Why don't we take these rituals that have become empty rituals, and why don't we infuse them with meaning so they can communicate the gospel. Why, Mom, why do we put a tree in our living room? That seems crazy at Christmas. Why do we do that? Son, daughter, it's to remind us that this is the birth of Christ who came into the world to die on a cross. Well, it's an evergreen tree. Yes, it is, because the love of God never fails. Why do we give presents to each other? To remind us of the greatest gift of all, that when God gave his son. Why do we put lights on the tree? Jesus is the light of the world. Why do we put ornaments, those round ornaments on the tree, to remind us that Jesus Christ loves the whole world, that he came for the whole world? I mean, there's ways that we can communicate the gospel through these rituals. Don't let them be empty. Okay, I get off my soapbox now. Why do we have rabbits and chocolate eggs? I have no idea. I don't think there's any redemption in that whatsoever. Colored eggs, what does that mean? Okay, on we go. So, well, back to our study. God now repeats how they were to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I'm having some problems with my computer here. Verse 6. He says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, well, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. See? Passing it on. It shall be a sign, as a sign to you on your hand, and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. As we saw last week, leaven is a symbol of sin because of how leaven does its work. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was to be a reminder to them that they were called to be a holy people. Not only were they delivered out of Egypt, God wanted Egypt to be out of them. And when he says the week-long holiday was to be a sign on their hand and between their eyes, he means that it's to influence how they think and what they do. While God meant this figuratively, later Jews applied it literally in the wearing of what's called phylacteries. And here's a picture of a Jewish soldier wearing phylacteries. Notice the little box that he has on his forehead here. It's tied with a leather strap around his head. And then you'll notice the strap around his hand and his arm leading up to a box that's on his bicep. The box is a little awkward to have it on their hand, and so they put it on the bicep where it's more out of the way, but they attach it to the hand by this leather strap. And there's a certain way that young Jewish Orthodox boys learn how to tie that on so that they can put the phylactery on. The picture on the left is a picture of an open phylactery. It's got Jewish scriptures that are handwritten on parchment, and they're stuffed in the box because the idea here is, God's word is to be on your mind and on your hand. God meant that figuratively, but they have fulfilled it literally by actually putting it on their bodies. Verse 11. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb, that is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have. The males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. The command to consecrate the firstborn, in verses 1 and 2, it's now elaborated. This is how you are to consecrate them. All firstborn males of both man and beast were to be set apart as belonging to God. The way that you dedicated something to God was by sacrificing it. How do you give something to God? Well, you devote it to him, which typically meant you sacrificed it. You killed it and put it on an altar. So we have a problem, right? There are two sacrifices God says he won't accept. People, God does not, he's not into human sacrifice. He's very much against that. And unclean animals, like donkeys, can't be offered to God. So instead of sacrificing the firstborn of these, they were to be redeemed, that is, bought back. Later we learn that firstborn sons were redeemed with silver. There was a certain payment that they had to make, while firstborn unclean animals were redeemed by offering a clean animal in its place, sacrificed. This redemption is symbolic of what God did in the Passover and the Exodus. Israel was God's firstborn, redeemed with silver that the Egyptians gave to them, and the substitutionary redemption of clean animals for unclean speaks of Christ's death in our place. He was clean, we were not. He was offered in our place. Verse 14, and so it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? That you shall say to him, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb. But all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. And so, repeating that, clarifying, and now we get some geography of the route that they took when they left Egypt. Verse 17, then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. The quickest route from Egypt to Canaan was along the coast. The ancient route was called Via Maris, the way of the sea. It was a well-known and well-traveled highway, but the problem is it led through the region that the Philistines now occupied. The Philistines were a maritime power that had recently arrived in the area. They originally settled in northern Egypt, but the Egyptians had come forth with their army and had pushed them back into the sea. They had then traveled further north along the coast and ended up landing on the coast of what will later be Israel, the coast of Canaan. And they settle in there and they dig in and they become quite a powerhouse that settled right along the coast there of Canaan. So knowing that the Philistines would rally and come out against these 2 to 3 million people that want to come through there, what kind of an impact would 2 to 3 million people make traveling through the land? Right? Do we want 2 to 3 million refugees coming through Oxnard? Right? Imagine that. Imagine what's going on in Europe right now with all these refugees from the Middle East coming in. Okay, so you got 2 to 3 million people that want to come through this area. The Philistines are going to come out in force, and the problem is that the Israelites are not at this time thinking like soldiers. They're still thinking like slaves. And so God says, listen, we can't go towards the area of the Philistines because they'll come out in force, make war, and the children of Israel will freak out and run back to Egypt. So can't go that route. So notice there the red route is the Via Maris going up into the Philistine territory. The green route is the traditional route that for years and years and years people have assumed that Israel took. Verse 18, so God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. So Moses knew if they're going to get anywhere, they have to be organized into some kind of arrangement. Their camp and their marching order would be according to their tribe and their clan and their family, as we'll see a little bit later. So they turn away from the coast. God leads them into the wilderness that's next to the Red Sea. Verse 37 of chapter 12 says that they traveled to Sukkoth. They went from Ramesses, the city that they were centered around there in Goshen in Egypt, and they travel southeast towards Sukkoth. Now notice they cross the Gulf of Suez, which is the northwest side of the Red Sea. On the other side of the Sinai Peninsula, you have the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay, so the traditional route is where they crossed the Red Sea was over the Gulf of Suez and then went to Sukkoth. More recent research suggests that it was not the Gulf of Suez that they crossed, but the Gulf of Aqaba. And we'll see that a little bit later. Verse 19. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he, that is Joseph, had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, do you guys remember this when Joseph said, don't leave me here? Remember? God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. And so they took their journey from Sukkoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before his people. So God now manifests his presence in a pillar of smoke and fire, smoke by day or cloud by day and fire by night. And wherever the pillar went, that's where the people followed. That's how they made their way and knew where to go. God became their guide through the wilderness. Now, we'll get through chapter 14 tonight. Verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea opposite Baal-Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, well, they're bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. So the way God describes they were to travel and camp fits perfectly with the eastern side of the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians had forts throughout this area. We know because there's archaeological ruins, and we know that they were occupied by Egyptians. Messengers were constantly carrying reports to Pharaoh of the track that the Israelites were taking. And it seemed that they were now trapped, that they were hemmed in by the sea, and they were easy pickings. Verse 4, God says, then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all of his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am Yahweh. And they did so. So, apparently, fickle Pharaoh has recovered from his grief at the death of his son. He kicks himself for the moment of weakness that allowed him to send Israel out. So he's going to, listen, I'm going to take Egypt's army and we're going to go after these guys and we're going to get them. They're obviously lost in the wilderness. They don't know where they're going. They're trapped by the sea in the wilderness. We'll go down there and we'll get them back. Egypt's army was its great pride. It was the arm of Pharaoh, just as Pharaoh was considered the arm of Ra, Egypt's chief deity. Now, since the rest of Egypt has been humbled by the plagues, it's only fitting that the army of Egypt be humbled as well. History tells us that while there were other groups emerging at this time several hundred miles north, Egypt was the undisputed master of the Middle East. No one could stand against their army. Well, God's got a plan, and it means seeing that other people besides the Egyptians rise to power. So Egypt has to be brought low so that these other peoples like the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Babylonians can emerge. Also, Israel needs to see that when God fights for them, they are invincible. They're going to face a tough challenge in conquering those Canaanites and later the Philistines. And so they need to see God's power. So that pillar that led them, listen, it goes back and forth in the wilderness. Just put yourself in their sandals. Okay, the pillar's here. Pack up. Here, on we go. And you march over here, and it stops. And so you camp, and you spend a couple days there. And then the pillar goes around to behind your camp and goes back to where you were before. You pack up your stuff, and you go, didn't we just come this way? And you go back to a camping spot you were before, and you camp there. And then the pillar goes back to where you were before. You're like, why are we going around in circles? What is going on here? And in your mind, you're thinking, is God lost? Why are we wandering around and wasting our time here in the wilderness? Let's get on with this Canaan land of milk and honey thing. Let's go. Does God explain himself to us? No. He says, trust me. I know what I'm doing. What was God doing? He was making Israel look confused so that those messengers would send a report to Pharaoh, so Pharaoh would think, ha ha, and he would bring his army out so that God could humble Egypt. But God didn't explain that to the Israelites. He just said, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Christian, listen to me. You're not just going around in circles. God knows what he's doing. You might think, time's getting on. Lord, you need to be doing something here. And God is saying, I'll do what I'll do in my time, not yours, in my time. Trust him. Trust him. He knows what he's doing. Verse 5. Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants were turned against the people, and they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? I was like, oh, look at why have we done this? Well, I can think of 10 really good reasons why you've done this, you knucklehead. This proves that rebelling against God makes smart people stupid. Verse 6. So he made ready his chariot, took his people with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen, and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. So we're getting geographical markers here so we can identify where this is. Because the Egyptians were mounted, they easily overtook Israel, who's now hemmed in the southern end of Sinai. Chariots were the most sophisticated piece of military technology at that time. When you read the word chariot here, think of a M1 Abrams tank, because that's pretty much in that time, that's what that was. These 600 choice chariots, or heavy chariots, had 2 men. One drove while the other was an archer. In a pinch, even the driver would tie the reins around his waist, and then he could shoot as well. Just the appearance of these things on the battlefield was enough to cause enemies to surrender. There is a carving that is in one of the pyramids of an Egyptian 2-person chariot. And you can see the rein there that's tied to the one guy's waist and the 2 bows. That's, by the way, that's a carving of Ramses II going into battle. The Pharaoh is a type of the devil in all of this. Of course, Egypt is the world. Pharaoh is a picture, a type of the devil. And so think about what's happened, right? Israel's been delivered from bondage in Egypt, the world, by the blood of the Passover lamb. And they're on their way now, going to learn about their covenant with God and who they are as his people. And what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh comes after him. Christian, please understand something. Satan didn't give up on you the moment you were born again. He didn't go, oh, darn. I mean, he did do that, but that didn't stop him from coming after you. He's hard after you, trying to pull you back into bondage. So don't think, that life is going to be a cakewalk because you become a Christian. Satan's going to come after you. He's going to try to take you out. But know this, God is on your side. And he's going to deliver you, and he's going to give you victory. Remember why God did all of this, to prove his power over Pharaoh and over Egypt. Verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and so they were very afraid. Now wait a minute, just earlier we read that when they came out of Egypt, they came out with boldness. But now they're very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, Wah! Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Because you were slaves there? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. How pathetic. I'll tell you, one of the most disheartening things that I've heard in some counseling situations is people that have said, you know what, it was easier before I became a Christian. It would have been better if I had never converted. What? No. These Hebrews haven't learned how to live by faith yet. So their circumstances set their emotions rather than their faith in God's power and promise. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. See, the people didn't know what God was doing. They thought they were trapped with the sea on one side and Egypt's army on the other. But God had told Moses that they were going all the way to Canaan. They weren't going to die out here. So even though Moses didn't know yet how God was going to get them to Canaan, he knew that he would. And so he calmed the people. I love this. This is so typical of a leader. He calms the people. You know, stop whining. It's okay. God's going to come through. And then he turns, God, please help us. Oh, I've done this. I've done this with our church. I've done this with our family. You know, it's going to be okay, folks. Really, it's going to be okay. Christ is coming. And I go to my office. Oh, God, please help. You've done it too, though, so come on. I love God's answer here. You know, all this is so good. Verse 15. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Folks, listen, prayer is never wrong, but it can never take the place of action. There's a time to pray, and there's a time to act, and now was the time to act. Verse 16, God says, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. And so it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud of darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. Isn't that a great picture? Remember, Satan's going to come out after you. Who's going to defend you? God's going to defend you. He's going to protect you. Satan can't lay a hand on you unless God allows it. And if God allows it, it's because God is going to use that to make you stronger. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land. And the waters were divided, so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground. And the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. That had to be trippy. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now, we have a picture of this, of Moses showing his parting the sea. There's a picture that was taken on an iPhone 1 back. Okay, yeah, just a little joke. Little joke, very bad joke. Very bad joke. That rod in Moses' hand was the symbol of his call to lead Israel. Remember, he's a shepherd of the flock of God. When he lifted it and the waters divided, please understand, this is not just, God doesn't tell him to do this for no reason. Everything God tells us to do is for a reason, folks. Why is Moses lifting his rod and the seas part? Because that rod is the symbol of his leadership. Do you realize what God is doing? He's affirming Moses' leadership in the sight of all of the people. Very important that the people understand that Moses is the leader that God has chosen. That God has chosen. So then the wind blows, it divides the sea, it dries up the bottom so that it's dry, it's not all muddy. The pillar of God's presence moves from before them to behind them as a rear guard so that Pharaoh's force can't attack the last of the Israelites as they cross. That pillar becomes a light to Israel's path because they start this trip at night, but it brings darkness and confusion into the camp of Israel. This is yet another evidence of Pharaoh's foolishness in that he's committing his army to follow Israel into the sea. You got to wonder if some of these soldiers are like, you want us to what? Go. You go. I mean, come on. The water is standing on two sides. That's Israel's God doing that. And if Israel's God is doing that so that they can get through the sea, get away from us, escape from us, maybe God's got something planned. Verse 24. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud. Remember, because it's traveling right behind, right? It's keeping them from catching up with Israel. And he troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. Oh, well, I guess so. That's not a chariot anymore, that's a drag. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord, that is Yahweh, fights for them against the Egyptians. You see, God is just toying with them. And the Egyptians acknowledge that Israel's God has helped them. Gee, Mr. Egyptian, what clued you into that? Is it that wall of water on your right and your left hand? Is it your wheelless chariots? Now, regarding these chariots and videos and archaeology, there are some interesting videos out today that claim to identify the real route of the Red Sea crossing. Amateur archaeologists have gone to great lengths in looking for evidence. There's been a bunch of expeditions that have been staged over in this area to find evidence of Israel's passing and camping and where they crossed the Red Sea. One of them found a vast scrapyard on the seafloor of many smooth metal artifacts to which the local coral wouldn't attach because it was too smooth. Among the artifacts were chariot wheels that were dated to the 8th dynasty of Egypt, which is right at this time. So I wanted to go over with you some of the main routes that are used. The blue line is the I don't have my pointer with me. The bottom route there, the blue line that crosses the Gulf of Suez, that again, that is the traditional route that for years and years and years people thought Israel took, and that they crossed the Red Sea up there at the north end of the Gulf of Suez. And then traveled down to the very tip of the Sinai Peninsula where they said Mount Sinai was. Okay, that's why it's called the Sinai Peninsula. Better evidence suggests that either they took the red route right from Ramesses to Sukkoth and then straight across and then came south a little bit and crossed there in the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba. That's where Ron Wyatt thinks that they crossed. But the majority view now is that they came across the red line, and then there in the middle dropped down and took the purple route down around the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and then this is where they kind of went back and forth and came back north and crossed at where it was the narrowest, actually, between the Sinai Peninsula and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And there's actually a land bridge that's 200 meters below the water there, and it's the closest point. And then they believe they found now the actual Mount Sinai, not in the Sinai Peninsula, but actually across from it, over at, see where the red line and the purple line meet? They found a mount there called Jabal Alaz, which they believe is the original Mount Sinai. And now listen, here's one of the main evidences for this. When Moses was on the run after he murdered the Egyptian, where did he go? He went to the land of Midian, where he was a shepherd for his father-in-law, Jethro. Midian is not in the Sinai Peninsula. Midian is in that region of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And remember what God said in the burning bush. He says, you will return to this mountain. So the evidence is that that is in fact where Mount Sinai is. It's on that side, and that's where they go, of course, after they cross the Red Sea. So there's some good videos out there that you can watch that have lots of evidence, but this is where most of your scholars today believe that they actually crossed, not Suez, but they crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba. All right, verse 26, and we'll wrap this up. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians on their chariots and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. And so the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And so the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. And so the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. And friends, that was the point of all of this, right? To demonstrate God's power. He wanted his people to know that they'd not just been delivered from Israel's presence, they'd been liberated from Egypt's, did I say Israel? From Egypt's presence, they'd been liberated from Egypt's power as well. And nothing could teach that better than standing on the shore as they see these bodies washing up on the shore now. These guys that had come after them to take them back into bondage are going to oppress them no more. And we will come back to that in our lesson on Sunday.